I warned her on the wagon road from Cutter's Crossing, about 3 miles out from the ranch, when the silence had stretched long enough that I figured she deserved to know what she was riding toward. I said it flat. The way I said most things. I don't smile much, I told her. Probably ought to say that before we get to the gate. She was looking at the range, not at me. The dry sage flats spread out westward, in that particular shade of amber it gets in late October, and the sky above it was the color of well water. She had one hand in her lap and one on the rail of the wagon seat to steady herself on the ruts, and her traveling coat was pressed and dark blue and entirely wrong for this country. She turned and looked at me then. She had steady gray eyes that didn't ask permission before they looked at a thing. "All right," she said. "Just that, all right." I waited for more. There wasn't any more. She went back to looking at the range, and I went back to the reins, and I told myself that was the end of it. I had written the listing because my foreman, a long-suffering man named Cord Birch, had sat me down at the kitchen table in September and told me the ranch needed a woman's steadiness. "You're running this place like a man who's already left it," he said. I didn't argue with him. My wife, Clara, had died 3 years prior. Fever. One hard week in February, and since then I had kept the house the way you keep a tool. Functional, cold, useful. Cord was not wrong. So I wrote the listing. Practical arrangement, good land, fair terms. I wanted a woman who could keep the books and not require conversation. I expected someone quiet and grateful. What stepped off the noon train at Cutter's Crossing was Vera Caulfield, who had been a schoolteacher in Hatchfield, until her schoolhouse burned in August, and who carried herself like she was still standing in front of a classroom of 30 and expected everyone to follow along. She was not quiet. She was not particularly grateful. She looked me over the way you look over a piece of land you're considering buying. And she said, "You're Hollowell." Not a question. "I am," I said. "Good," she said, and handed me her trunk. That was the first indication that this was not what I had ordered. I gave her the east bedroom and pointed out the kitchen and the account books and said I'd leave her to settle in. She thanked me in the same tone she might have thanked a ferry operator. I went out to the barn and told Cord I thought there might have been a mistake with the listing. "What kind of mistake?" he said. "The kind where you get something other than what you asked for." Cord smiled, which I noticed because I rarely did. "Give it a week," he said. The first week she reorganized the account books, found 2 errors in the fall ledgers I hadn't caught, and asked me why I was running 60 head fewer than the grazing would support. I told her I'd had a rough spring. She wrote something in the margin of the ledger and didn't comment, which was somehow worse than if she had. The second week she asked why the barn's north corner hadn't been re-chinked. I told her I'd been meaning to get to it. She nodded the way a schoolteacher nods when a student has answered incorrectly, but she's decided to move on. She cooked without complaint and not without skill. She read in the evenings by the lamp in the parlor. She did not chatter, but she asked questions. Precise, quiet questions that arrived without warning, usually when I was occupied with something else and least equipped to dodge them. What had the ranch been like when Clara was alive? Whether I'd always kept my own company, or whether that was something that came on, whether I found the dry sage flats lonely, or whether I'd gotten past the point of noticing. I answered the first 2 with as little as I could manage. The third one I didn't answer at all, and she let it go without pressing. That surprised me. The women I'd known in town had a way of pressing. "I'm not trying to trouble you," she said one evening, when I'd been more short than I had a right to be. She was at the table with the ledger, and I was standing by the door with my hat in my hand. I just find that I learn a place faster by asking than by waiting. "What are you learning?" I said. I didn't mean it to come out like a real question. It did, she considered. That you ran a good ranch until 3 years ago and you've been coasting it since. That you're not as cold as you want people to think. That you miss her, but that's not the whole of what's wrong. She looked back at the ledger. "That's what I've got so far." I put my hat on and went outside. I stood on the porch for a while in the cold and looked at the stars, which were numerous and indifferent, and I thought about what she'd said. She wasn't wrong about any of it. That was the problem with Vera Caulfield. She had a schoolteacher's precision, and she applied it to things you'd rather she didn't. The third week the crisis came. It was past 9 at night, and the temperature had dropped hard, and Cord came to the house at a run to tell me the south fence was down along the draw, and the herd had spooked at something. Maybe a cat, maybe just the dark, and were spreading into the ridge timber where there was a drop of 30 feet off the north face, if they went far enough in, the wrong direction. I had Cord and one other hand that night, a boy named Ames who was competent but young, and I needed a third rider who knew which way the draw ran. I came through the kitchen for my rifle and found Vera already at the table pulling on, her second boot. "I can ride," she said. "I grew up with horses. Tell me which way the draw runs, and I'll take the east side." "This isn't a schoolroom," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's a dark fence line and you're one rider short. Tell me which way." I looked at her for a moment. She looked back with those gray eyes that didn't ask permission. "East side runs to a rock face," I said. "You hit that face, you turn them back toward the creek, not toward the ridge. You don't go into the timber no matter what." "Understood," she said, and took the lantern off the hook. We were out there 2 hours. She took the east side and she worked it right. I could see her lantern moving in a clean, steady arc, not panicking, not charging, just pressing the fringe of the herd back toward the creek in long, patient sweeps the way someone does it who grew up knowing how animals think. Ames and I pushed the main body down from the ridge, and Cord got the fence rail back up by lantern light, and by 11 o'clock we had them counted and settled, and the breach closed. I found her at the creek watering her horse. She was breathing harder than she was letting on, and there was mud on the good dark coat, and she was looking at the water with that calm school teacher's face she put on when she was deciding something. "You did that right," I said. It cost me nothing to say. It was true. She looked over at me. "The east face runs north-northeast," she said. "I thought you should know I noticed." That meant she'd worked it out in the dark before she ran the arc, mapped it in her head so she knew exactly where the drop was. I hadn't told her which compass bearing. She'd figured it by the stars. I didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say. We rode back to the house without talking, which was our usual habit, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been before. There's the quiet of two strangers, and there's the quiet of two people who've done something together that required them to trust each other, and they're not the same. She was washing mud off her coat at the kitchen basin when I came in for water, and I said, "That was a good coat." "It was," she agreed. "I'm not troubled by it." "I'll get you another one," I said. "From Cutter's Crossing, before the hard freeze." She looked at me then, and something passed across her face that I couldn't read and didn't try to. "Thank you, Nate," she said. It was the first time she'd used my given name. I noticed it the same way you notice when a room you've walked through 100 times is suddenly lit a little different. It was a week after that, on a Sunday evening, that she asked the question. We were on the porch. The sun was going down over the flats in a slow bleed of orange and copper, and the cold had an edge to it but wasn't unkind yet, and she had a cup of coffee in both hands and was watching the light the way she watched everything, with that complete unhurried attention, as though the thing in front of her was worth the full cost of looking. "Can I ask you something that isn't about the ranch?" she said. "You can ask," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "What made you stop?" I knew what she meant. I'd known she'd get there, eventually. "Clara died," I said. "I know," she said. "But that's not what I mean. People lose someone and they grieve and they keep going. They laugh again eventually. They find things worth noticing. You stopped. Not just the smiling. You stopped letting yourself find things worth noticing." She looked at me steadily. "I'm just asking what made you decide that was the right thing to do." I held my coffee cup and looked at the flats, and I didn't answer right away, because the answer was something I hadn't said aloud, and I wasn't sure I could. "I think," I said finally, "I was afraid if I found something worth noticing, it'd be taken away again." I paused. Seemed easier not to. She nodded slowly. Not the teacher's nod, just a nod. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said. "Probably," I said. The sun was mostly down now, just a hem of light along the flat horizon, and the first stars were coming up in the east, and the sage smelled cold and clean. Vera Caulfield was sitting 4 feet from me on that porch in her repaired traveling coat, and she wasn't looking at me and she wasn't pressing, and I thought about the east fence line and the lantern moving in its clean arc, and what it meant that she'd mapped the face by starlight before she ran it. I thought about what she'd said, that I'd decided, that it was a decision I'd made, not something done to me. Something shifted in my chest, not painfully, more like a hinge that had rusted shut, moving slow and careful on its way back. "There's a view from the North Ridge," I said. "In the morning, when the frost is on Sage and the sun comes up over the Sawback Range, it's—" I stopped. I hadn't described that view to anyone in 3 years. I'd looked at it most mornings and felt nothing and kept walking. It's something worth noticing, I said. I'll take you up there if you want. She looked at me. Those gray eyes, quiet and full. I'd like that, she said. And I smiled. I didn't plan it, and I didn't notice it happening until I felt it, and then I couldn't have stopped it if I'd tried. It started somewhere behind my eyes and moved, and Vera Caulfield saw it, and something happened on her face too. Not a laugh, not surprise, just a warmth that went all the way through. There it is, she said, soft. Don't make a fuss, I said. I'm not making a fuss, she said. I'm just glad. I looked out at the dark flats and the rising stars, and I let the smile stay, because it turned out the keeping of it cost less than I'd thought. We were married in November, in Cutter's Crossing, with Cord as witness and snow coming sideways off the Sawback Range, and Vera in a new coat I'd gotten from the dry goods store, which was not as fine as the dark blue one but was warm. And she said it suited the country better anyway. I take her up to the North Ridge most mornings when the weather allows. The frost on the sage, the sun coming over the Sawback, her breath in the cold air beside mine. She doesn't say anything up there, and I don't say anything, and we both find it worth the full cost of looking. I smile a fair amount these days. Cord has commented on it more than once, with a satisfaction he doesn't try to hide. I let him have it, he earned it. What I know now, that I didn't know the morning I drove that wagon out to Cutter's Crossing to collect a practical arrangement, is that there isn't a soul on this earth who can make you open a door you've decided to keep shut. But there are some people who stand patient and steady on the other side of it, and let the light come through the gap underneath, and sooner or later you can't pretend you don't see it. Vera Caulfield stood on the other side of that door for exactly as long as it took. Not a day more, not a day less. I didn't deserve that, I know I didn't, but I have spent every morning since on that North Ridge trying to make it worth her while, and I do believe, that she thinks I'm getting there.